All right, let's begin. Welcome to the fourth and final space of our series on Kostin Almaru's Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy. This chapter, we've done a series of spaces about the introduction and each of the chapters in this book, covering in turn a chapter on the phenomenology of pre-philosophical political life, sort of the the longhouse and the way that pastoralist aristocrats took over those kinds of societies, and then the sort of rich thinking about nature that emerged from the contrast between the aristocrats and their the underclass. Then in chapter 2, we looked at the way that Pindar expressed aristocratic, archaic Greek ideas of nature in his odes celebrating the victors in the Panhellenic Games. These athletes. This is when there was much discussion of the ancient Greek term phusis, which later on in Greek philosophical culture came to stand for something like nature, but before that meant the body, blood, inborn talent, heredity, a kind of life force that could exist in a person to a greater or lesser quantity and give them more or less reality. Then in the third chapter, we discussed Plato's sort of exoteric and esoteric defenses of philosophy, primarily in his dialogue, The Gorgias, where Socrates questions three interlocutors about the role of rhetoric and philosophy. The last one, Callicles, was the most important to Dr. Almaru's project, and this is when we really this is centuries after Pindar, and really gets into the deep connection between philosophy and tyranny, especially the way that both the philosopher and the tyrant tend to view the conventions, the inherited pieties, the laws and the customs of their society as merely conventional, as and perhaps not just different from nature, but perhaps even opposed to nature or anti-natural. So that the Plato space was the last one we recorded. Today, finally, we're talking about the fourth chapter, which is called Nietzsche on the Origin of Philosophy and Tyranny and the Decay of Aristocratic Regimes. And in many ways, although Nietzsche's writing is multivalent, goes back and forth on itself, it's very thrilling to read Nietzsche, especially in the sort of the way that he presents kind of the drama of self-overcoming in the articulation of his own ideas, and constantly, this is a concept that comes up later in the chapter, but he's cruel to himself in interesting ways, always seeking to purge not only what's false, but even what's low or weak within him. And this is a quality of Nietzsche's writing that I've always found to give it a certain manic energy that makes it complex and challenging to read. But overall, I would say that perhaps this chapter is one of probably the easiest chapter to follow along and read. The idea, but by the time the reader reaches the fourth chapter, she's well prepared to understand the lessons Nietzsche has to impart. They bear a close resemblance to Dr. Almaru's overall thesis. In general, he's in some way he's expounding Nietzsche. He's taking Nietzsche, applying it backwards to this. First to the pre-philosophic society, then to Pindar, then doing a deep reading of the Gorgias in Nietzsche's terms, and then finally we get to Nietzsche. So there's a bit of a recursive nature to the project in the sense that it's the last chapter that really provides most explicitly the interpretive frame through which Almaru reads the material in the previous chapters. But it's not just, but there's also a historical narrative, I think, that justifies leaving Nietzsche to the end, which has to do with the course of European history, the domestication of the European herd animal, the draining of the potency of philosophy over the course of the Enlightenment and perhaps especially the 19th century. What emerges is a way in which Nietzsche is a reformer of the Platonic philosophical project. So that brings us up to this chapter. We're ready to sort of read Nietzsche's theses in the light of everything that Dr. Almaru has given us. And so to me, this chapter is fairly straightforward. It makes a lot of sense. It's largely a commentary on Nietzsche, perhaps mostly focusing on Twilight of the Idols and especially Beyond Good and Evil. Interested to hear what Alejandro thinks about that. But in any case, I know we've all prepared, lists of passages we'd like to read and discuss. We'll go through the chapter, in a fairly linear way, and then of course have time for a Q&A here at the end of the space. Alejandro, would you like to begin your discussion of this chapter?
Yeah, thanks for the great intro, Charles. Let me just say a quick couple of housekeeping type things. We're expecting to be joined here in a little bit by the artist formerly known as Spergler Acolyte, who was in the first space and the second, but was nuked before he could return. But he is now capable of joining spaces. He just has a time issue. So we'll be expecting him. Otherwise, as Charles said, it'll be the three of us doing two and then three of us doing the presentation until we go to the Q&A. Yeah, I wanted to say a couple of things. I think the way you laid it out makes perfect sense, and we should just get into the material. But maybe one or two thoughts that are, I guess, just complementary to what you said. First of all, Almaru makes clear from the beginning that the inspiration of the whole thesis that became this book is Nietzschean, and so the reading of Nietzsche here has the burden of showing. First of all, showing sort of where that inspiration comes from. And here, I would point out, as you correctly guessed, someone who has read a bunch of Nietzsche will immediately look at what specific texts of Nietzsche are being referenced, and will notice that he is leaning, heavily on Twilight of the Idols, and possibly most heavily on that chapter in Beyond Good and Evil, which is the natural history of morals. That isn't a criticism. I mean, it's expected in a work of this sort, in a dissertation or a book based on one, to stay focused. But it isn't it's somehow meant to be an exhaustive picture of Nietzsche. Rather, it's a depiction of the elements that lead to the particular argument. Second, there's, I think, a bigger question that maybe we'll leave to the end, but it's the biggest question I have coming away from not just this chapter, but reading the whole work, which is, okay, so now what happens? That is, if it is right that whatever this, we were talking last time, and Almaru uses the language, this kind of emergency operation which is his description of philosophy, trying to recapture what is most vital in the aristocratic way of life and somehow encoding it into its, as he says in this chapter, spiritualized form, its ascetic form. If all of that is right, and if Nietzsche is by noticing that, picking it back up and doing it again in his own way, repeating that, well, we're already 100 years or more out from that. So what is the status of this gesture now is the question I bring to this. And, one of the immediate things that occurred to me here, it's a little odd to make this reference, but I'll just be honest and say this is what I thought of, is a remark made by a leftist reader of Nietzsche, Gilles Deleuze, who said something like, well, the sort of philosophical horizon of the 20th century was opened up by Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche. And we see Freudians, we see the psychoanalytic school, we certainly see Marxists and communists. Are there really any Nietzscheans? And that's the question Deleuze asked in a lecture he gave in the 70s. Well, I'm less concerned with that discussion, but I do think it's a good question. Who are the Nietzscheans? And I think that's, like I said, I'd rather leave that for the end, but I thought it'd be worthwhile to pose it at the beginning. So just to get going, I think I'm going to orient us by reading the first paragraph of the chapter, which I think is a great orientation to the general question. So I'm on page 227 here, if you've got the physical book. In Nietzsche appears the most direct, explicit, and clearest exposition of my main argument in this thesis, namely that philosophy and tyranny are in some sense deeply connected, perhaps identical at their origins. There is a historical process through which Nietzsche reveals this connection to the reader, a sort of, quote, natural history of morals. And again, that's the title of that chapter in Beyond Good and Evil. The decline or decay of a type of aristocracy allows for the distillation, the abstraction, or the radicalization of the aristocratic ethos, of the principle underlying aristocratic life, which, as has been argued in the previous chapters, is to be reduced to the classical standard of nature. This radicalization results in the tyrant and the philosopher as twin or complementary types. The appearance of philosophers and the philosophical way of life is historically not separable from the production of potential tyrants. According to Nietzsche, these represent, to put it provisionally, the aristocratic type as unmoored from the strictures of aristocratic morality, from attachment to any particular historical regime. To put it even more bluntly, the prerequisite for both the tyrant and philosopher is the genius. And although the emergence of any one particular genius is a matter of chance and not something that can be planned in precise crossbreeding by states, classes, or even families, the types of cultures and conditions of culture in which specimens of genius are produced are, if not something that can be planned, something that can be understood. General conditions, the patterns of which are historically similar. Yeah, so the main question I have here, I'm trying to recall if the notion of the genius came up earlier, and off the top of my head I can't. But I'm wondering if this is a sort of new element that Nietzsche is adding to the twinning of the tyrant and the philosopher. And specifically, I'm wondering whether that is in part a result of Nietzsche's concern for the aesthetic. I don't know if you've got any thoughts there, Charles.
Yes. I can't remember if the genius per se is in the Pindar chapter, but what I thought was interesting about, he follows Nietzsche's account of the genius very closely, which is a figure. The genius is it's kind of interesting. It's Nietzsche has this sort of counterintuitive take on the origin of the genius, where the genius comes from. It's not so much that the genius is the summit or pinnacle or height or culmination of something of a human specimen that a society is building up towards, but rather that it's the genius is the volcanic discharge of pent up energies and forces that have suddenly been unleashed because the constraints previously placed upon them have been removed, right? So sometimes we get he says later in the chapter that these geniuses emerge, especially in the cultural sphere, at a time of political decline. And there's one other way that I would relate this to the Pindar chapter, Alejandro, which is that if you remember when we were discussing the athletes in the Pindaric odes, it's striking to the degree to which they're not individualized as people, right? They're types. They are specimens, representative of a lineage or a clan or a city. They're they're not so much discrete, autonomous individuals as they are meshes of connections between the gods and previous heroes and members of their family. And in this chapter, there are some passages which talk about the way that aristocracies were bred primarily for their warlike virtues, which would assist in the self-defense of the state. And I think maybe for mental shorthand here, we can think about something like the Spartan regime that breeds and cultivates these almost uniform type of guys, right? That are the same in all of the ways that matter, that are good at fighting in armies and doing various things. They're not necessarily noted for their eccentric individuality. And so all of this pressure is applied to the human specimen to mold it into these somewhat rigid forms, right? Both through eugenic breeding, physical training, physical and moral training, and things like that. But then once, and so the work of many generations goes into producing this sort of superior aristocratic type. But then once either the state falters or the aristocracy loses its authority, its privileges, its purpose for being, then all of that energy sort of can dissipate in 1,000 different ways, very suddenly, very violently. And this is when you have the profusion of many highly individualized types of people, some of whom are defective and broken, but others are extraordinarily creative people, philosophers, tyrants, geniuses, etc. This is the Nietzschean account of how the genius emerges from a decaying aristocracy. And I just think it's worthwhile to remember the non-individuated aristocrat of the Pindaric odes from chapter 2 when we're thinking about these new geniuses that suddenly emerge out of these people and sort of are free even of the sort of the traditional ethos of the aristocrats. So that's kind of my comment on the genius there.
Yeah, that's very nice. I'm wondering, I mean, this is going too far afield, so I'll just throw out the question and we can keep going, but it may be interesting for someone listening. I'm just wondering to what extent that particular notion in Nietzsche is a response to, a result of his taking in the perspective of some of the romantics of Goethe, or there's also discussion of genius and Kant's critique of judgment and so on. But I take your point that there is this emphasis on training, right? So rather than than trying to, let's say, produce a genius, which you can't predict. They come like fate. You can, well, what options do you have? You have selective breeding and you have training, right? You can try to create the conditions for the genius. But and the paradox here is that the genius is, of course, in his unpredictability, highly individuated. But the best terrain, so to speak, for the genius to flourish is a highly regimented, combination of breeding and training. Okay, let me throw out a little more from the book here. I was just thinking more about Nietzsche's project. This is, I'm going to read a little bit from 229 and then, 227 and 229 and 232. So he writes, it is important to emphasize in all that follows that Nietzsche's chief lifelong task and concern is not politics, morality, the well-being of this or that community or people, the well-being of the abstraction, quote, the individual, or anything of the sort. Nietzsche's chief concern, insofar as his public or political teaching is concerned, is the preservation or resurrection of philosophy. And here, of course, we're going to repeat the same kind of question that was brought to reading Plato, right? If the public or political teaching is the preservation or resurrection of philosophy, what is the private teaching? In a little bit, Costin's going to switch to the language of esoteric and exoteric. But I wanted to read another bit, which I think is useful on what notion of philosophy is at stake here. And this is from 232. Find the passage. Yeah. The passage, well, he's quoted a thing, but the passage just quoted reveals an important and related elements of Nietzsche's understanding of philosophy, which is that philosophy is a way of life. The understanding of philosophy as primarily a way of life and not just a discipline of learning, let alone the substance of any one particular teaching or ideology, remains consistent throughout Nietzsche's writings. And so above we see that he complains that in his own time, this is a quote from Nietzsche, no one may venture to fulfill philosophy's law with his own person. No one may live philosophically with that simple loyalty which compelled an ancient, no matter where he was or what he was doing, to deport himself as a Stoic, if he once had pledged faith to the Stoa. Close quote. Elsewhere, he repeats the same idea when he remarks that the great writer and dramatist Heinrich von Kleist committed suicide because of what he learned from Kant's philosophy, and that while this self-destruction of a great mind is to be lamented, it nevertheless indicates an intensity and seriousness regarding philosophy that doesn't exist in Nietzsche's own time. Kleist made Kant's philosophy his own and lived it. His greatness as an artist is arguably inseparable from this seriousness. So here we have, just in a minute, I hope we're going to get to the explicit discussion of esoteric and exoteric, but before we do that, just noticing this particular qualification. First of all, that Nietzsche's public political project is the preservation or resurrection of philosophy, but then that is again qualified by saying, but here he means an ancient ideal of philosophy. Philosophy is a way of life, which Nietzsche is specifically skeptical about, setting aside a couple of examples such as Kleist. He's skeptical that this is the common or even the available picture of philosophy in his moment. And back over to you, Charles.
Yes, I have a question for you along these lines, Alejandro, which is that, so Costin writes that Nietzsche is most concerned with the preservation and resurrection of philosophy. Later on in this chapter, he quotes Nietzsche's own words on what he sees as his central project, which is the uncanny problem of the psychology of the improvers of mankind. Now, I'm suggesting that these may be related and perhaps maybe even close to being identical with each other, because it's interesting that, on the one hand, the philosopher is like the crown of high culture. Resurrecting philosophy is about creating the condition, sort of creating the conditions such that humanity can reach its highest potential in the philosopher. On the other hand, So that's sort of like, that's one way to approach the resurrection and preservation of philosophy, by making a society that produces philosophers. On the other hand, what's the content of philosophy? Alamaru suggests that it has to do with the improving of mankind. And again, I wonder, is this a kind of a recursive type of thing, right? Where it's like the philosopher is the person who can apply the lessons of nature to the improvement of humanity, in order to produce and perpetuate more philosophers. I'm just wondering, I guess, Alejandro, my question for you is there a relationship between Alamaru's claim that Nietzsche's main project is the preservation and resurrection of philosophy, in Nietzsche's own words, that he's most interested in the uncanny problem of the psychology of the improvers of mankind?
Yeah, I see what you're getting at. I think when Nietzsche uses that phrase, the improvers of mankind, he is being ironic in the sense that he thinks it is almost by definition a failed project, to a doomed project to try to come up with some universal morality. So to take one example, think about the kind of psychology of happiness, right, which prescribes, or what we today call therapy, right, which prescribes certain attitudes or practices that are supposed to be available to everybody and will help anybody that comes into contact with them, or a kind of generic utilitarianism, anything really that today falls into the umbrella of self-help, right? These are, I think, more, they're kind of degraded avatars of his more general diagnosis of Christianity as a Platonism for the people or for the masses. And so the key distinction will fall there. It's not as though there isn't an important, unironic sense of the improvers of mankind, but the claim, I think, here will be that this improvement is of the few, not of the many. And so when someone claims to be improving the many, we should place a question mark over that.
Maybe. I wonder though if because we could say that with Plato's Republic, with the breeding programs that are in that utopia, there's a way in which the improvement of mankind is also this core philosophical project. And again, Nietzsche is, what he's trying to say is that it's the psychology of the would-be improvers of mankind that matters. Given that everyone is trying to improve mankind, what is it that about the psychology of those who are doing it? Are they full of misplaced empathy for the wretched and broken? Are they full of admiration for the strong and the beautiful? That sort of determines, that psychology of the improver of mankind then determines what their political projects look like, and whether they're eugenic or dysgenic, things like that. So I see your point that he's being somewhat ironic when he says improvers of mankind or the would-be improvers of mankind. But I think that the Victorian missionary society of Nietzsche's day probably thought that they were improving mankind by shipping Bibles to the Congo or whatever, and just like other followers of Nietzsche later in the 20th century probably also thought that they could improve mankind in much different ways. So in any case, we can move on from there. But
Well, maybe just to put it more neutrally, we should just, first of all, notice that there is a drive to improve mankind that repeats and takes on different forms, and so that part we don't have to debate. And then second, yeah, that the phrase admits of more or less ironic understandings, right? So that even as you said, I said earlier in my remark was quoting Deleuze asking, "Are there really any Nietzscheans?" Well, there certainly are would-be Nietzscheans. So it's not as though there's absolutely nothing to talk about. The question is, what does that have to do with this project as described here?
One more note on the psychology of the improvers of mankind. I remembered the passage from Beyond Good and Evil that I was going to mention. Nietzsche says that humanity is unique because we contain we are part sculpture and part sculptor. We are part creature, part created. There's the mud, the clay, the shattered fragments in us that constantly have to be reformed into something that's, sort of makes life worth living. And there's also the active intelligence, the hammer, the anvil, that which is deliberately and intentionally doing the hard work of this forming and shaping and improving. And he says that so many people have pity for the created, or the creature, or the sculpture. So many people have pity for the formless mass, right, of human material, or the lumpy, shapeless clay of human material, and they want to save that and they want to protect it out of pity. But no one has pity for the sculptor. No one has pity for the hard work that the sculptor has to do, the relentless fashioning of this raw material into something beautiful, right? And so that's when he says, we have to have pity against pity. Anyway, that's my last comment on Nietzsche and the psychology of the improvers of mankind. But I think it's directly related to the way he thinks about the preservation of philosophy, and ultimately what the purpose of preserving philosophy is and how one goes about it.
All right, that's good stuff. Thank you. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit still in this. At least this is the last bit I wanted to share from the introduction to the chapter. And this has to do with Alamariu's assessment of the esoteric and the exoteric in Nietzsche. So we talked about this a little bit in previous spaces, but if you weren't around, roughly speaking, this is a distinction in modes of reading, or perhaps types of readers of a text, where the exoteric would be the something closer to the face value or surface reading of what a text seems to say, and the esoteric would be something that would be somehow dissimulated, concealed, or said indirectly, and would perhaps only be accessible to a select few, certain kinds of readers. And our friend Stephen is here, and I think he provided a helpful qualification, because I think we came too close I take responsibility for it, came too close in a previous space to saying that the exoteric aspect, the outward aspect, is entirely false, or right. Rather, here the idea is exoteric is a necessary, let's say, protection for the esoteric message. I see our friend Spergler has joined us, so let me bring him up. Hello, Spergler. So we're in section 1 here. Jump in whenever you want, my friend.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I was going to read here from page 235 a little bit about the exoteric and esoteric. To say that in Nietzsche's exoteric moral and political program we find ultimately the defense of philosophy is then not to search for, quote, irony or, quote, metaphors, but to understand the concept of spiritual warfare. Precisely in achieving his political and moral aims in earnest, if he is able to do so, will philosophy find the ground the spiritual and cultural preconditions from which it can once again flourish. Nietzsche breaks with the Platonic project and points back to the, quote, dark roots of philosophy because he shares Plato's ultimate aims. They disagree only as to tactics. It is the crisis of Nietzsche's time, a crisis in large part created by the failure of the Platonic project, that compels him to think it necessary to break entirely with the Platonic project of, quote, political philosophy. And I'm going to skip a little bit and read another, from the bottom of 235. In this connection, an analogy may be useful to understand the distinction between the esoteric and exoteric in a doctrine in general, and in our case in particular. In certain religious teachings, for example, Sufism, speak quite openly of this distinction, as do, quote, heretical sects of Islam in general. Now, Sufism is often taken to be a mystical or spiritual interpretation of Islam. And in the West, a certain claim has become popular in the press that, e.g., jihad means spiritual struggle, is a metaphor for inner spiritual struggle, and that the outward meaning of war on unbelievers is merely metaphorical or should be interpreted, quote, spiritually. That is, that jihad means primarily inner spiritual struggle. This reading has some superficial truth to it, but fails precisely in the same way as the above-mentioned interpretations of Nietzsche fail. This reading, almost exclusively drawn from schools like Sufism and Ismailism, or from Islamic philosophers, all of whom avowedly speak of the distinction between an overt and a hidden teaching, fails to take into account what exotericism actually means. Exotericism does not mean irony or metaphor, and is never just mask or mere rhetoric. What could be the purpose of that? Accordingly, we see that throughout its history, Sufism has never in practice opposed jihad as physical war on unbelievers, but embraced it even within our own time. And it keeps going here, but mainly I want to underline this notion, first just to repeat, first that the exoteric and the esoteric both have a positive value. The exoteric doesn't merely have the function of dissimulation, and again, I owe that point, or at least being able to be clear on that, to dialogue with Stephen in an earlier space. And then second, that the exoteric is also never something like irony or rhetoric, if rhetoric simply means a kind of vacuous, let's say, airy restatement of something that's meant to distract or confuse from the main point. I'll pass it over to you guys here.
Yes, so I have one interesting question to sort of follow up on that and to bring it back to bear on the Platonic political project, which is that to say it's very easy for me to see how, if we think about Sufi esotericism, right? If we think about the exoteric physical armed struggle of jihad being the impregnable wall that defends the inner garden of the esoteric spiritual contemplation, the relationship between the exoteric and the esoteric feel very natural and intuitive to me. But in the Platonic case, Dr. Alamu writes something, he writes about these sort of exoteric values of philosophy like piety, justice, and moderation. And then on the other hand, of this esoteric project that involves, in his words, the lust for forbidden knowledge and things like that. And I'm wondering exactly how I wonder if maybe I missed this passage, or maybe you can offer your own thoughts on this, Alejandro and Spergler. But how does the accomplishment or the establishment of the exoteric values of justice, moderation, and piety, how does that make the philosopher's own esoteric aim, especially the lust for forbidden knowledge, how does it protect it and shelter it and reinforce it and make it possible? It's less obvious to me in the Platonic case than it is in the Sufi example that Dr. Al-Maru gave.
Well, off the top of my head, I think the answer would be that it gives a program for the many, maybe not the illiterate many, but the many at least who are reading here at the surface level or following those precepts or educated according to those precepts. It provides a set of guidelines and an order, a kind of second order nomos, if you want, and thereby those people will not interfere with the esoteric project.
But like to the extent that, like, say in the Islamic world, you know, a physical conquest and a battle against unbelievers may be necessary to secure the political stability and resources to promote this other kind of contemplation. They seem directly related. Whereas, like, if you convince everyone in your state that everyone, that the thing to do is to become moderate and just and pious, then they may not like the philosopher tyrant when they do emerge, right? Like that seems that the exoteric Platonic message contradicts the esoteric Platonic message. There's a bit more of a clash and a bit more friction between them than in the example of Sufi. Although I have to admit, I'm not very informed on the specific content of Sufi spirituality. But it's kind of like if you convince everyone that yes, you should lead moderate, just, pious lives, but don't mind me, the tyrant, I'm just obeying my nature and flouting all the things I just taught you. It just seems like there's a contradiction there that maybe we should tease out if we can.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think. I mean, as I read this paragraph, I think the analogy with with Sufism and so on is not meant to be perfect. It's meant to be illustrative. But I think really the thing to do would be to go back to the idea that, according to Nietzsche, the Platonic project had, in some significant sense, failed and needed to be recommenced on other premises. And so that tension that you're pointing out, I think, is something that was not visible, entirely in Plato's time, because he was posing a project, in a highly imaginary way, you could say, in the Republic, and then a couple millennia went by, and there was plenty of evidence to think about to what degree had this and other sorts of projects worked out, right? So I think that is the sort of unstated premise here.
That's a great point. Perhaps the contradiction that I identified is what leads to the swallowing up of the esoteric by the exoteric, in the case of especially Platonic Christianity and in subsequent European history.
Quick question. Did you guys, I don't remember if this is in this part of Costin's book. Did you read the Nietzsche quote on why he values Thucydides more than Plato?
No, you want to share that? You got it in front of you?
Yeah, I'm like scavenging through the index of Daybreak real quick. But, the upshot of it is that he essentially sees something. Oh, here it is, 103. I'm going to read this right now from Daybreak. I think this is section, let's see, 168, a model. What it is I love in Thucydides, why do I honor him more highly than Plato? He takes the most comprehensive and impartial delight in all that is typical in men and events, and believes that to each type there pertains a quantum of good sense. This he seeks to discover. He displays greater practical justice than Plato. He does not revile or belittle those he does not like or who have harmed him in life. And he goes on continuing this kind of sophistic idea of a more practical and honest observations of questions of justice and whatnot. And, perhaps this goes back a bit to the exoteric project that Nietzsche's engaged with, that within Plato, that there's some sort of there's like a cover-up job. I think elsewhere in Daybreak, or maybe it's elsewhere, but he talks about this kind of the ancient error in which we see kind of Western philosophy come out of this tradition of Plato and Aristotle, and these kind of esoteric teachings, perhaps, of certain things like selective breeding. And that if this ancient error had been undone, or had it never been committed in the first place, that we might have a more honest kind of understanding of some of these questions of morality and whatnot. But it seems like still that there is like a kind of necessity for the esoteric, something about like the noble lie being required in a certain political circumstance such as that Plato found himself in. At least that's my reading of it. I'm still getting a bearing on the conversation here.
No, that's good stuff, Spurgler. Yeah, I mean, this is a big question. I'm just going to throw it out. We don't necessarily have to get into it, but it does make me wonder. There's some remarks about historicism here at the end of the chapter I'm sure we'll talk about, but it does make me wonder about the larger picture here. That is, do these can we talk about a sort of endless repetition of these flowering of aristocracies and then decline, including even this radicalization and attempted spiritualization? That is, can one really learn a lesson from history in such a way as to inflect it in a different way in the future? And I think that's sort of an open question with regard to this material. If you don't have anything else, Charles, I'm going to start reading from section 2, and let me know.
Yes. Let's continue.
Okay, so I wanted to look a little bit into a passage on 245, which I think helps us pursue this line of thinking. So this has to do with the notion of philosophy as an abstraction or radicalization of aristocratic values. And Alamario writes, "The mechanism in general follows the pattern just presented regarding physical culture, aesthetics, and beauty. In that case, we have seen Nietzsche argue that, on the one hand, Socratic dialectics itself was a spiritualization, or, quote, abstraction of the Greek agon, right, the contest. And on the other hand, that the inspiration for the Platonic philosophy had as its prerequisite the actual existence of beautiful Athenian youth, which again in this case even more strikingly presupposes not just an aristocratic idea or institution, but one of the actual end products of the aristocratic regime, which was so focused on physical breeding and training from its conception. Thus, although, as we are about to see, the flowering of high culture does require a liberalization of sorts, that's in quotes, it is not the liberalization itself that is the cause of high culture either. It is valuable only insofar as it, quote, frees up aristocratic energies and redirects them toward the life of the intellect." And I just wanted to couple that with another passage from a bit later on, but I think it's worthwhile just thinking about this spiritualization. He talks about, did I get the page right here? The ascetic mask. Yeah, this is from the bottom of 263. "The philosopher becomes doctor of the soul to the Greeks. This was Plato's great achievement in finding a new foundation for the virtues of reason, or rather, in finding a way to use reason to restrain and tame the decadence of the instincts that Greeks suffered from at the end of their culture. The philosopher's ascetic mask is the creation of Platonism, the wily and salutary public lie that was to guarantee the safety and even supremacy of the cause of philosophy in the Hellenistic and later Roman world." And so the bit I want to think about here, which has to do with the esoteric and exoteric functions of philosophy, is that in the first passage, the notion of the spiritualization of the agon and this kind of qualified liberalization, and then in the second passage, this notion of the ascetic mask. All of these elements, right, if we view philosophy in the, let's say, popular exoteric way, seem like they're recipes for absolutely everyone. But the esoteric reading, at least the first leap into it, would be that these are actually, first of all, for the few, not for the many. And second, that even for those few, they are really preliminaries to something else. They are part of the training regimen and not its outcome. hand it back to you guys.
I mean, I think what strikes me as most interesting about this section is this question of like liberalization and exactly what it means. There are some good passages in Twilight of the Idols where Nietzsche's discussing kind of like the role of Napoleon, and also this question of whether or not Napoleon kind of represented the zeitgeist. And Nietzsche's obviously making the case that he's kind of like this antithetical movement to some of the developments of things in like the French Revolution. I can read a little bit. So this is from 44 from Twilight of the Idols. My conception of the genius. And it should also be said quickly that this role of the genius becomes very, I think, important for other questions of historicism. But anyway, my conception of the genius. Great men, like great epics, are explosive material in whom tremendous energy has been accumulated. The prerequisite has always been, historically and physiologically, that a protracted assembling, accumulating, economizing, and preserving has preceded them, that there has been no explosion for a long time. If the tension in the mass has grown too great, the merest accidental stimulus suffices to call the genius, the deed, the great destiny into the world. Of what account, then, are circumstances, the epoch, the zeitgeist, public opinion? Take the case of Napoleon. The France of the Revolution, and even more pre-revolution France, would have brought forth the type antithetical to Napoleon. It did bring it forth, moreover. And because Napoleon was different, the heir of a stronger, longer, older civilization than that which was going up in the dust and smoke in France, he became master here. He alone was master here. Great human beings are necessary. I'm going to stop reading there. That's just such an interesting way to be like reading Napoleon as kind of this like, a petty aristocratic figure, but somehow like he's even physiologically a preservation of this older type. And that there's kind of like this moment in which you have like the French Revolution where you can kind of destroy some of like the older forms of perhaps like a decadent French aristocracy. And this allows for a kind of like rebirth of a more kind of vitalistic and bare bones, but also honest version of aristocracy, of a kind of unbridled will to power and the conquest of a great man and whatnot. So I kind of find reading kind of liberalization in that vein a bit fruitful. I don't know how you guys feel about it.
Yeah, this is great, Spurgler, and I think before you joined us, we were talking about the genius, so that was also accidentally also a really great connection to that earlier conversation. I think just to put something beside that, because I think it would be most interesting if we had both of these examples. We have the Napoleon one that you just read there, and then there's, I think, a kind of rather more pedestrian one, but makes sense to put it next to that one, I think, which is the kind of, let's say, sort of generic philosophy 101 version of the sort of benefit of the Socratic dialectic, right? That now any man can go into the agora and speak with any other man, and it is simply the power of his reason that will determine the truth, and not some appeal to a previous revealed authority or existing order. And there's a sort of optimism placed there that this will, I mean, and it's an optimism, I think, partly visible in, at least if you take Alamario's view, the exoteric dimension of the dialogues, right, that this will lead to recognizing virtues such as justice and temperance and so on. And this is also, I think, the discussion that Alamario has about the two ways to look at the Gorgias, that on the exoteric reading, it seems as though the tyrannical leanings of Callicles are overcome, and on the esoteric one, it seems like perhaps philosophy is more closely allied with tyranny than was visible on a first reading. So the liberalization is this kind of experiment in which, by loosening up these strictures, on the one hand, the, let's say, selectively bred types are able to, like I said earlier, sort of spiritualize the agon or put on their ascetic mask, function in this new concealed way. But on the other hand, exoterically, there is a sort of message that's laid out as to what this means and who it's for and so on. And I think the tension is visible there in figures such as Napoleon as well. I mean, I'm just sort of gesturing without giving the full interpretation. Let me pass it back over to one of you.
I guess I'm just trying to think exactly how that might kind of play out in the French Revolution and its history. I don't know how concretely we want to get into an example, but I mean, in some ways, I still think this perhaps there's some sort of alliance going on even then in France at the time, between people like Rousseau and all these intellectuals in France, and how that kind of paves the way for the explosion. I'm not sure where else to go from here.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about the liberalization. It's basically like, I mean, just to recap a little bit of the Nietzsche that you read, it's the accumulated pressure, the forcing of the human material into these somewhat rigid forms of these aristocrats that are primarily meant for the self-defense of the regime. And then once either the regime breaks down, like in the case of like the French Revolution, or in the case of ancient Athens, the sort of dominance of the demos and democracy, and the suspicion that the natural elites come under, where they have to find a different purpose. This is where the genius in all of their individuality emerges. It's this explosive discharge of these energies into many different directions and many different exotic forms that emerge out of that. But I think we can continue with our sort of explication of the chapter, Alejandro, if you're ready to move along.
Yeah, I got another passage lined up. This is from 257, and this is what he calls a summary of Nietzsche's argument leading into the third and final section. So he says, let us summarize Nietzsche's argument. An aristocratic regime has its origins in necessity, in particular in the danger of annihilation. Barbarians, feral men, impose themselves on top of a sedentary or possibly more civilized population and have to maintain their position under the threat of constant danger, first of all from below and from abroad. Faced with relentless pressure, they are forced to sharpen and intensify those qualities, and only those qualities, that are favorable to their continued survival and the maintenance of their position. These qualities they call virtues. Such virtues can in general be summarized as martial ability and political ability, the Homeric Andrea and phronesis, or roughly courage and practical wisdom. Together with these is intensified a closely related but separate set of virtues, now in quotes, that may with some humor be called the social virtues, for they replace the Platonic justice and temperance, but instead Nietzsche emphasizes intolerance and the associated qualities of cruelty and of pathos of distance. And this, for people that don't know, pathos of distance, I mean, there's a couple ways to read it, but generally it has to do with the feeling of superiority, or the sort of disdain for the lesser, the plebs. It is only through the latter that the former substantial qualities can be inculcated over many generations in what Nietzsche calls a program of breeding and training. Indeed, he calls the aristocratic polity as such a program of breeding. Such a regime tends to a homogeneity of type, again under the pressure of necessity. Deviations are not tolerated because there is no luxury and no time for them under conditions of permanent pressure. And that last bit is what Charles and I were going back and forth on in the conversation about the genius and breeding. So one more paragraph. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's interesting here that when Alamari was talking about the role of these virtues, right, which are favorable to the continued survival and maintenance of their position, perhaps the exoteric Platonic virtues of temperance and justice and piety can also be understood in this way, that these were the necessary virtues that had to be taught in order to ensure the continued survival and maintenance of the philosopher of the the aristocratic school of philosophy.
Right, and this is why I wanted to emphasize that point that Stephen was kind enough to share in an earlier space, that the exoteric is not merely fake, right? It's not merely a lie. It has a particular function, right? But it has to be understood in relation to the esoteric and not as a kind of final program. And I think when we get later on to the idea of Platonism for the masses or for the people, the mistake will be precisely to interpret the exoteric as the entirety of the program, as the entirety of the function of philosophy.
So, do you want to continue with the next paragraph?
Yeah, so I'm still in this summary here. This is now 258. Excuse me. Okay. The aristocratic regime furnishes the, quote, raw material for the further development of high culture, and in particular philosophy, in two closely related ways. First of all, the institutions, practices, strictures, and pre-rational sentiments inculcated by its education or training. For example, the sentiment Nietzsche calls pathos of distance, the feeling or instinct for variations in rank, for the chasm that exists between slave and free man, for the talent in obedience and command, is a prerequisite for, quote, now this is a quote from Nietzsche, longing for an ever new widening of distances inside the soul itself, the development of ever higher, rarer, more distant, more expansive, more comprehensive states. That is, for the enhancement of humanity, or development of higher aspirations and high culture. Or, to take another example, the agon, an aristocratic institution of competition, especially athletic competition, but which Nietzsche elsewhere also calls the inner engine of the Greek political life, is refined by Platonic political philosophy into dialectics. And there, with the longing for an ever new widening of distances, right, we see, right, what is, I mean, I think this is a great gloss on this idea of spiritualization that we were talking about earlier. This, I think, is what we should. Yeah. Anyway, this is the esoteric project in the sense that it is for the sake of this spiritual state in the soul of the few that the entire project exists. But at the same time, it's important to consider that all of this is still under this umbrella of an emergency measure. It is in some sense being the aristocratic morality is in some sense being mutated or evolved into a kind of new state or new formulation of the soul through breeding and training to allow it to survive in an emergency condition.
At the bottom of page 271, Dr. Almaru writes, the inner or esoteric program of Platonism, on account of which the overt moral and political teaching is only a means, is the salvation or preservation of nature, or to put it in other words, the, quote, existence and ever-renewed procreation and preparation of the genius.
Right. So we're back at that same issue where you can't breed a genius, but you can try to breed an environment in which the genius will flourish.
You know, one thing I might add right here. I don't know, Alejandro, if I just cut you off, or if my my computer just exploded.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
Okay. I mean, it's quite appropriate that this is kind of coming from Nietzsche, you know, talking about like the pathos of distance. I think, I mean, you know, you look at the way he organized Ecce Homo, it's hilarious. You know, the chapter title is like, why am I so wise? Why am I so clever? Why I write such good books? And I think that this goes back to this kind of anthropological point where you have these two visibly different populations. One is just clearly, you know, innately superior in terms of health, in terms of physical aesthetics, and this sort of things. And this becomes a sort of kind of engine by which you kind of question why these differences are there. Like, what exactly, perhaps, accounts for these sorts of differences in human development, and what makes for the higher and what makes for the lower. And this is really, it seems like, the very beginning of it, and also just a general desire always to push it further, to become better. And this is the importance of the agon, especially in the case of the Greeks.
And just to put a fine point on this, and to call back to something that Alejandro said earlier, the beautiful and strong Greek youths of the aristocracy were the endpoint of this breeding program that was, to some extent, done by instinct. But these beautiful bodies, as we readers of Plato know, inspire the philosophers, right? They inspire them to perhaps think about the ideal form of beauty, but also perhaps also to conceive political projects that can maintain them and give them certain prerequisites and privileges and powers.
All right, so if it's start with you guys, I'm going to jump into the third section, which is specifically on Nietzsche's reading of Nietzsche on aristocracy and the decay of, that's the second one. The third one is Nietzsche on Platonic political philosophy. And this, I think, will help further the discussion about the ascetic mask and so on. In fact, the first bit I read about the ascetic mask is already here in front of me. But I wanted to actually read the passage about Platonism for the people. So a little bit from 263. According to Nietzsche, Platonism, Plato, corrupted by Socrates, plebeian moralism, picked up on this cure. The cure was common to all the Socratic schools, and that it consisted of moral philosophy, moral exhortation, the general purpose of which was to have a taming or calming effect to the application of reason. The purpose of Platonic moral philosophy, then, and it must be emphasized that so far as we are talking only of its exoteric or public function, was to bring order to the anarchy of the instincts, to try and reestablish virtue, inner order, on a new foundation. The older, surer foundation of aristocratic breeding and education, which formed the instincts themselves in a salutary direction, was now lacking. The instincts were at war with themselves. This new foundation was reason, through which therefore the philosopher, as the man of reason, suitably decked out in a mask of piety, temperance, justice, supposedly now the opposite of the intemperate, lustful, criminal tyrant, becomes the guarantor or virtual priest of moral life and good citizenship. The philosopher becomes doctor of the soul to the Greeks. This was Plato's great achievement in finding a new foundation for the virtues on reason, or rather, in finding a way to use reason to restrain and tame the decadence of the instincts that Greeks suffered from at the end of their culture. And I've already read this, but I'll reread. The philosopher's ascetic mask is the creation of Platonism, the wily and salutary public lie that was to guarantee the safety and even supremacy of the cause of philosophy in the Hellenistic and later Roman world. I'll read a little more here from 264. Platonism was successful in its project in antiquity. The safety of the Socratic schools, as well as other philosophical schools, was assured through the end of Hellenistic or Roman civilization. But an unforeseen historical development derailed and warped the Platonic project. What Plato and his followers didn't count on was the emergence or eruption of an international missionary religion based on revealed truth. The final result of the Christian project, which is also the final result, surely unintentional, of the Platonic project, is the misbreeding of modern European man. Christianity was Platonism for the people, or, which is the same thing, an entirely exoteric Platonism, a Platonism with a priesthood that no longer understood nor cared for the fact that the outward moral and political orientation was meant as a protective outer wall for an inner garden where nature itself was nurtured and preserved. The quasi-Platonic priesthood of medieval Christianity for all its spiritual profundity, was incompetent when it came to the needful task of caring for the overall development of man or the cultivation of human nature, a nature they denied. And this is partly what I was recalling in our exchange earlier, Charles, about the improvers of mankind, because I think that the priesthood here would be the first case in point. Let me turn it over to you guys.
Yes, one comment here that's interesting goes on to talk about the sort of the concrete ways in which the medieval priesthood misbred European man. He discusses how the sort of prohibition on cousin marriage. First of all, we should say that how did the Christian Church misbreed man? Well, they first of all they asserted a monopoly over marriage, right? That's the first thing. Often in Almar's description of these breeding programs and things like that, it comes down to marriage laws and creating the right incentives for the right people to marry and produce children. But so we can say that, of course, the Christian Church monopolized the institution of marriage. Aristocrats who wanted to marry each other had to have their marriages approved by priests. There was no marriage outside of the church. And I guess there's probably many explanations for how and why the church approved or prohibited certain marriages, but one of the broader, I guess, like sociological things would be like the battle between the church and native aristocracies over the control of property and rental incomes, right? The church being one of the largest landowners, and the way that they tried to sort of, sometimes they cooperated with aristocratic families, sometimes dioceses were appropriated or infiltrated by aristocratic families that could place, second or third sons as powerful abbots or bishops. But over the long haul, by encouraging exogenous marriage, by prohibiting the marriage of cousins and the concentration of property and power in certain families, they effectively bred this sort of outward-facing, open to outsiders, exogamous aristocracy that that had a kind of homogenizing tendency. So instead of whereas if you think about like evolutionary theory, this speciation and differentiation occurs in isolation. As if a population is isolated and breeds among itself, it becomes and it sort of unfolds according to its own inner logic. It becomes highly differentiated from other populations. But if you have an institution like the church that is continually forcing these perhaps isolated aristocracies that may have been devoted to the cultivation of their own ideas of excellence, if the institution of the church is forcing them to continually outbreed or to marry out to other groups, to other nobilities, to other branches of the European aristocracy, you end up sanding off some of the more particular differentiation, creating a more homogenized noble class that tends to be, and then as European history marches on, aristocrats, are more reproductively successful than commoners. These traits get passed down through the social structure and end up becoming dominant. But you end up with these people who are very open to outsiders and not the jealous guardians of their own kind of inner instinctive forms of excellence. That's one way. That's one way to interpret what Alamaru says about the Christian misbreeding of the European man and the creation of the European herd animal. Curious to hear how you, Alejandro, or Spergler would gloss that kind of assertion about history that Alamaru gives us here.
We have to legalize cousin marriage. This is the first step. Okay, this is how we win. Um, but I mean, this is. I think this is an important point. Like, for example, the Amish, they have higher rates of first and second cousin marriages, and this is an important point because it allows this kind of like niche group to kind of stay and stay among themselves and to continue their traditions without having to necessarily take on too many outsiders. And then in the case of the aristocrats, you don't have to take on too much bad blood to keep your kind of thing going. And I think generally what Alamaru is saying here is that there was this dysgenic element going on where the church was forbidding these kind of marriages and therefore breaking up some of these clans that were no doubtedly breeding their family members into this kind of particular direction. I mean, sometimes I think we still say this kind of like, at least in like the U.S., like, he's such like a Smith. Like he had and a family will go through these sort of qualities that they associate with themselves that make a Smith, for example. Just obviously a generic name there. Go ahead and hop in, Charles.
Yes, and just to clarify, like, no one's saying that maybe I shouldn't say no one's saying, but I'm not saying that like marrying your first cousins is a great idea, but it's more about the prevention of the crystallization of the clan, or the intentional dissolution of the clan. We're talking about very large family groups, talking fourth, fifth, sixth cousins. While the church had legal prohibitions on first and second cousin marriage, by other means, political and by asserting their own privilege to bless or prohibit marriages for whatever reason, they could also prevent power from accumulating in these clans and prevent these clannish types from congealing and crystallizing into differentiated human types.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add here is just that with regard to the misbreeding of European man, I don't really know this the church history in depth, but my guess would be that these considerations were primarily considerations having to do with political power, and so the knowledge of breeding was, if anything, was either implicit or entirely just not part of the equation. And I think this could lead us back to the introduction that Alamaru added to the book version of this, where he talks about these two, relatively speaking in historical terms, recent discoveries of, on the one hand, genetics, which is obviously what you two were, basing your analysis on, and on the other of the sexual market or marketplace, that putting this kind of understanding back out into the open and allowing us to interpret history and present circumstances through it does seem to set the stage for asking precisely this question of breeding again. And that, I think, is what Alamaru is leaning on in the introduction, where, although he doesn't sort of seek to base the importance of his philosophical argument on this, he definitely inflects it in a particular way by signaling that these questions have come out into the open in a particularly noticeable way in our time. So if it's okay, I'm going to read one last passage here from the third section, and then maybe we'll talk briefly, or not briefly, however, we'll just talk about the appendix, which kind of goes in a different direction. But this is from 270. Man is a political animal in a very literal and direct way then, not merely in the sense of human nature being fulfilled in the polis, but also from the other direction. Nature achieves this end through an instinct that binds the lower classes to the growing power of the state, precisely on account of its force, power, and violence. There is an instinct to be attracted to these, a chilling idea perhaps, and not one that ancient Socratic political philosophy would have discussed with such frankness at the very least. More disturbingly still, Nietzsche believes that the state either exists or ceases to exist insofar as the possibility for war is present. Quote from Nietzsche, through war and in the profession of arms is placed before our eyes an image, or even perhaps the prototype of the state. Back to Alamario. Originally conceived in war and for the purposes of waging war, the state as such is the prototypical state, the pure state as such is Sparta. I didn't read that right, sorry, start again. Originally conceived in war and for the purposes of waging war, the state as such, the prototypical state, the pure state such as Sparta, has as its internal program only one thing, the production of military genius. And then I'll skip the quote from Nietzsche. No, I'll read the quote from Nietzsche. In the highest castes, one perceives already a little more of what is in this internal process is involved at the bottom, namely the creation of the military genius with whom we have become acquainted as the original founder of states. In the case of many states, as for example in the Lycurgan constitution of Sparta, one can distinctly perceive the impress of that fundamental idea of the state, that of the creation of the military genius. And then back to Alamario briefly. It is then entirely to this purpose that the Greek state is directed, and therefore this purpose, the creation of military genius, is in some sense the original, quote, intention of nature. The, quote, return or, quote, ascent to nature, to the nature of the genius, originally of the military genius. Human nature is, quote, achieved or manifested in the production of genius. And it goes on there. I'll skip a little bit. Man as such is matter or raw material for the work of the legislator or founder. So this gets back a little bit to the discussion about the role of the esoteric and exoteric. It seems as though now we can ask this question of the exoteric is perhaps right the shaping of the instinct to be attracted to the, well, he says here, the growing power of the state, or later the raw material for the work of the legislator or founder. So in one sense, the raw material of the founder himself, the legislator himself, the genius, insofar as he is to be trained. But also now we're talking about the masses, and we get a very different picture than the Platonism for the masses. That's the main point. I hope I made it well.
That works for me, Alejandro. Shall we go? Do you want to just give kind of an overview of the appendix, which has to do with a debate between Leo Strauss and Alexandra Kojev, and then we can open it up for questions and answer?
Yeah, that sounds good. As long as Spergler doesn't have anything at this point. Okay, he's giving the thumbs up. Okay, so this chapter ends with an appendix. And, like any appendix, it's not essential for the discussion, but it is one of the places where you can see, aside from reading Nietzsche himself, where Alamario got the idea for some of this. And so there's a book called On Tyranny that collects texts by Strauss and his interlocutor Kojev on this question of tyranny. And there's a couple of bits I wanted to read. One has to do with historicism. This gets back to one of the exchanges I had earlier with Spergler. This is on 274. Okay, and let me just frame this just so as not to just launch into this abstractly. So the specific question I was going back and forth with Spergler on was whether this decay of the aristocracy and emergency measures and the whole thing is somehow a kind of constant, or whether it can be disrupted. That is, could the mission of the twin types of philosophy and tyranny or succeed, and if so, in what way? So I think with that in mind, 274. A cursory glance at Nietzsche's statements on nature quoted in this chapter alone shows that if he was a historicist, he was a strange kind of historicist indeed. In fact, he was not a historicist in any way. If the fundamental historicist insight is that all thought is historically relative, limited to its own horizon, that there is no trans-historical truth, then it is difficult to see how Nietzsche says many of the things he is shown to say above, including what he says about how he is able to divine the cryptographic teaching of Plato regarding the esoteric relationship between the state and culture, or the state and genius, which Nietzsche makes clear still holds in his own time. Nietzsche goes so far as to dismiss historicism, the milieu theory, as a neurotic's prejudice. He emphasizes that there is a fundamental disconnect between men like Alcibiades and Leonardo da Vinci and their own times, and we could add Bergler's example of Napoleon. They are not men determined by their own time. They represent or embody something older and stronger that is, in some sense, out of place with its own time and can therefore overcome an age of decadence. Yeah, I'll leave that one there. I think I had one or two other bits I wanted to talk about with historicism. Okay, this one is more general. So 276. The historicist claim is essentially that human nature doesn't exist. If human nature existed, then there would be access to a trans-historical and substantial truth about human life. To be a historicist and believe that all thought and all life is limited by the historical horizon is to believe in the malleability of the human species to a high or almost infinite degree. Custom or convention or the political regime conditions thought and action at every level, or at least at all significant levels. Okay, so those are the two main bits I wanted to share. There's a bunch of other passages, but historicism is one of the sort of main concerns here in the appendix. So see if you guys have thoughts on this.
I think it's just interesting that all of sort of political philosophy to some degree is about the malleability or rigidity and persistence of human nature. The historicist tends to believe that this malleability is a product of perhaps economic material conditions or an ideological superstructure that lays on top of that men can be taught to be a certain way or to care about certain things or to live a certain way. And Nietzsche also, we should say, believes in the malleability of human nature, but he emphasizes that first of all, what can be achieved is much more modest. It takes a great deal of work and time and perhaps even cruelty, and that the way that human nature is modified is not simply by redistributing property or banning misinformation or something like that, but it has to be first physiological, that it involves the breeding and cultivation of physical, biological humans. That's the only way that human nature can be, perfected or, on the other hand, corrupted.
Right. So I think the divide here falls between a kind of, let's say absolute malleability, where the idea is the human animal can be shaped in any way, and so we can have something like New Soviet Man if we declare it, and I don't know what they did to make it happen other than the propaganda gymnastics programs, I guess. I don't know, but I mean, they definitely had some inkling. But the other side of the divide is something I think much harsher, because on the one hand, it's relative. It isn't anyone can be made into anything, but rather a very few can be made better, right? And also only in certain specific directions, right? So there has to be some kind of preceding breeding, and then there has to be a very specific kind of training. And this goes back to the conversation about how the genius comes about. You can't, let's say, make everyone into a genius. You can't even make most people into a genius. So the sort of consciousness of physis that we were talking about, that emerges and that's documented in the first and second chapter, I think persists here in that particular insight. But to take on, what I'm calling the sort of relative version of malleability is also to accept, some version of the pathos of distance. This isn't really good news for the masses. And so this is either kept private, or if it's made public, it will be terrifying to some.
Right. Shall we? I'll just say that I definitely recommend reading the appendix. It's often in the debates when people are forced to clarify and defend their terms, that some of these ideas emerge most clearly, and Strauss putting all of his cards on the table, so to speak, in certain ways that he may not otherwise. So definitely read that. But
I just want to read one more bit, and this is funny because here, Alamario's claim, which I think is a good way to read Strauss, is that he doesn't put all his cards on the table. So one of the most interesting passages is from a letter from Koyev, where Koyev accuses Strauss of a bunch of positions. And without pinning them on Strauss, I think it is very telling as to the ultimate project of the book here. So this is from 282. This is Koyev's letter to Strauss. All this is hardly philosophy. The task of philosophy is to resolve the fundamental question regarding human nature. And in that connection, the question arises whether there is not a contradiction between speaking about, quote, ethics and, quote, ought on the one hand, and about conforming to a, quote, given and innate human nature on the other. For animals, which unquestionably have such a nature, are not morally good or evil, but at most healthy or sick, wild or trained. One might conclude that it is therefore precisely ancient anthropology that would lead to mass training and eugenics. And recall that quote I read earlier where Alamario interprets Nietzsche on the notion of political animal. I think the inclusion of this is pretty transparent. So maybe if you guys have final thoughts, we'll go ahead, and then we can see if some of our friends here have questions or thoughts.
Sure. By way of final thought, I'll just read again a sentence I've read actually in most of the spaces in the series, but one that I think is just very key to understanding exactly what Alamario's contribution here is. Right. A lot of this book is, bringing out the ideas of Pindar, or commenting on Plato, or reading Pindar and Plato through a Nietzschean lens, but if we think about the intellectual labor that Dr. Alamario is doing specifically, I think he's very open about this in the conclusion, in this sentence that spans pages 286 and 287, when he says the thesis has connected two separate claims. On the one hand, the claim by Nietzsche that philosophy and tyranny has its origin in a decaying aristocratic regime. On the other hand, the claim by Strauss and by classical political philosophy that philosophy has the idea of nature as its indispensable precondition. And so we can think of this book as showing how those two claims, that philosophy and tyranny come from its decaying aristocratic regime, and that the idea of nature is the indispensable precondition of philosophy, how those are part and parcel and connected with the birth of philosophy in ancient Greece.
All right, thanks, Charles. Yeah, and I'll just say, since we're going to kind of wrap it up here and transition to questions, I strongly encourage everyone to read this. We've been, trying to share and discuss the main arguments in each chapter. But there's all kinds of hidden gems, especially if you're a footnote enjoyer. I tweeted out yesterday, there's a footnote where, completely in passing, Alamario refers to this this fascinating essay arguing that Heidegger was a secret and disavowed reader of Schopenhauer, and that one could tease out a lot of being and time from Schopenhauer. Okay, maybe not of equal interest to everyone here, but just to say there's a lot of depth here beyond the primary theses, and it's worth your while. Okay, so that said, we've got our friend Stephen up. He's been participating in, I think, pretty much all our spaces, so happy to see you here again. Go ahead, Stephen.
Wow. Yeah, guys, really excellent space. I mean, really the whole series of spaces has been outstanding. I've been taking so many notes and learning so much, so it's really wonderful. I had two thoughts. One on this whole question of esotericism and exotericism that we keep looping on. And, we talked about Sufism and then Plato and how it's perhaps a little bit more difficult to interpret in the case of Plato. And just two kind of sub ideas there. One is about simply a way of reading, these two things as a way of reading. And I do think that in the dialogues, there are many places where it's quite appropriate to take into account the action as well as the argument. In other words, to pay attention to who is speaking, who is saying what, where they are coming from, and why Socrates might be, or whoever is replying, might be replying to them in some particular way, above and beyond simply the words that get said. So the action as well as the argument. And of course, the way Alamariu interprets the Callicles portion of the Gorgias relies critically on this, because he's carefully looking at how Socrates responds and making observations about whether those responses really quite make sense in context or are what we would expect in context, and the strength of various arguments or the weakness of various arguments that Socrates gives in response, and what that might tell us about Plato's intention, and whether or not you agree with Alamariu's reading of the Gorgias. I do think that way of reading, where you're taking into account who is speaking and why Socrates is responding in a particular way, I think that's quite legitimate and often important. But I think there's a larger sense of exotericism that we can see that's actually in some ways easier. And that's if we look, for example, at the laws, which criminally understudied in terms of its actual importance. It's Plato's last dialogue. It's his longest dialogue. It's perhaps his most explicitly political dialogue. I think you can say all the dialogues are political, but some more so than others. Obviously, the Republic, the Statesman, but the laws is just like, completely political from beginning to end, expressly. And you have a teaching on education in the laws that the Athenian stranger gives, where, in a sense, I think the exotericism is on its sleeve. I mean, it's like almost an inversion where the whole thing's kind of being laid out. And it's like, yes, we want a good, practicable regime, and that means teaching people in certain ways, and that may include things like festivals and music and songs of various particular sorts. And this is overseen by the guardians, who are doing this all specifically for the good of the regime. I mean, they're aiming at a best practical regime. And so you could say it's not even a lie. It's not even a noble lie, but it is a exoteric program whose purpose is to foster and maintain the regime for certain goods, for a variety of goods that ultimately include kinds of reflection that might not be possible in another regime. You have the Nocturnal Council, and there's I don't want to get into the whole thing, but it's, I think, a very rich source one can look at and see a lot of this stuff perhaps more plainly than in other places. And then the final thing I wanted to comment on was this whole issue of breeding, the breeding of European man or misbreeding, as the case may be. And it's just interesting. There's a book by the historian Tom Holland, very popular historian, called Dominion. And Tom Holland is not himself a Christian, but he's very sympathetic to Christianity culturally. He's sort of a cultural Christian, I guess you could say. And he talks about this exact point, about the influence of the marriage laws of the Roman Church in particular as being this deeply and pervasively influential on society and the evolution of society, and how clan or familial relationships kind of gave way to a more public kind of space in the West. And one aspect of this that I found very intriguing is that it seems to be peculiar to the Latin Church, to the Western, or we would now say Roman Catholic Church, but in the medieval context, they just would have said the Latin Church under Rome, and not so much the Byzantine Eastern Orthodox churches. They also had marriage laws, of course, and they didn't permit incest, but their laws were not nearly as strict in terms of the degree. It's called the forbidden degrees of relation that made it illicit to get married. They didn't proceed out nearly as strictly, so it didn't have quite this strong effect in the Eastern Church. And I was really curious about this. Where did this come from? Because it doesn't seem to have been Christianity per se. If it had been Christianity per se, you would have expected the Eastern Church to do it just as much as the Western Church, but it didn't. And as near as I could tell, it's actually a Roman influence. That it's sort of what the Roman Church did was it took specifically Roman, not imperial, but specifically like the city of Rome, Roman, traditions about marriage prohibition, and it kind of pushed them and radicalized them and extended them over time in a way that did not happen in the East. And I just found that very, very fascinating. The other interesting wrinkle is Holland makes a lot of the same observations as Nietzsche on a kind of purely factual basis, but because he's sort of pro-Christian, he gives them a different valence. He says, yes, all this happened and it was good, whereas Nietzsche kind of says, this all happened and it was bad. But he doesn't, the facts that they're pointing at, the sort of history and the influence of these marriage laws, they both basically agree on, which I thought was sort of an interesting fact, that a historian coming from a completely non-Nietzschean perspective himself, concurs with a lot of the same observations. And I actually pinged Holland on Twitter. He's on Twitter, and I said, do you basically agree with Nietzsche's account, only you think it's good? And he said, yeah, that's basically right. So I just thought that was interesting. That's all I got, guys, but thanks a lot for the space.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. That was great stuff, as always. Yeah, I guess I'm not going to get into the weeds with the details you shared, just because this is a little bit outside of any expertise I have, but with regard to the place you closed, which is the contrast between Holland and Nietzsche, I would just go back to my initial question as to what would it mean to be a Nietzschean? Is such a thing possible? Because if Almario is right, and there isn't just a diagnosis, but a kind of advocacy, what is its status today? That's the question I had. We have a new speaker here, Devin. Why don't you go ahead?
Hey, hello. Thanks for having me on, guys. I've really enjoyed these spaces so far. I haven't been able to get my hands on a copy of dissertation yet. Physically, I've been in Argentina here for a while, but I really enjoyed the spaces as a way to kind of learn about it. I was recently rereading The Beyond Good and Evil by Nietzsche, and there was a specific aphorism I wanted to highlight. That I think is incredibly relevant here to the idea of selective breeding and the birth of philosophy. I'm not sure if it's something that's explicitly mentioned within the dissertation itself. It most likely is, but I wanted to kind of read it aloud and maybe just really highlight it. So this is aphorism 213 and part 6 of Beyond Good and Evil, and it begins with, "It is hard to learn what a philosopher is because it cannot be taught. One has to know it from experience, or one should have the pride not to know it." And then cutting forward a little bit ahead in that aphorism, "For every high world one must be born, or spoken more clearly, one must be cultivated for it. The right to philosophy, this word taken in its broad sense, is conferred only by one's origins, and ancestors and bloodlines are decisive here. Many generations must have done the preliminary work for the origin of the philosopher. Each of his virtues has to have been individually acquired, nurtured, passed on, embodied, and not only the bold, light, delicate gait and course of his thoughts, but above all, his willingness for great responsibilities, the elevation of his ruling gazes and gazing down, the feeling of being separate from the crowd and its duties and virtues, the affable protection and defense of what is misunderstood and slandered, whether God or devil, the joy and exercise of great justice, the heart of commanding, the broadness of the will, the slow eye that rarely admires, rarely looks up, rarely loves." So not really anything too original there, but I just thought it was, rereading this with this kind of dissertation in mind. I mean, right from the get-go, Nietzsche, very explicitly, has this eugenic connection between philosophy as a eugenic project, and I just thought it was worth highlighting that specific aphorism.
Yeah, thanks, Devin. I think that we really didn't dwell on it today, and I think maybe just because this is a common currency in our circles, but there's definitely some valuable passages in Almario's dissertation that go against what has become the sort of predominant reading of Nietzsche, at least in the Anglo world, thanks to his translator Kaufman and his many leftist interpreters, which tries to bury these kinds of propositions and take them all to be metaphors or irony or something else. And I think we tried to deal with that. So yeah, I think hopefully one of the effects of reading this is that it's going to bring a lot of people back to Nietzsche and back to a more serious reading of the material. I also wanted to say, with respect to both the Nietzsche and the historicism, we've got our friend Athenian Stranger here who's done a number of great spaces on both topics. So be sure to check out his timeline for more insight on that. If anyone else wants to request, go ahead.
While we're waiting for people to request to ask questions, I'll just say that it's been great discussing selective breeding, the birth of philosophy with you guys over the past month or so. And for the audience out there, there's so much more work to be done on this book. There are hidden gems, ambiguities, puzzles, seams that can be exploited for further discussion and argumentation. Really, our series was about explicating the basic argument and outlining the content in a very sort of if not superficial way, at least taking the book on its face. And this is kind of a first reception and first commentary on the book, but not in any way conclusive.
Yeah, I'd just add there's a figure some of you may have heard of, known as the Bronze Age pervert. And I recommend looking at the book called Bronze Age Mindset and listening to Caribbean Rhythms. So you will find many echoes and developments of the same kinds of arguments and ideas here in other contexts. And I think there's a very productive area there to bring these materials together. And also, I would also add, with respect to the question of rhetoric, of how Alomariu speaks and how the Bronze Age pervert speaks. But it looks like we've got a new speaker, Max. Why don't you go ahead when you're ready, Max?
Thanks, Alejandro. I wanted to raise a few questions that the dissertation engendered in my thought. I've only read it twice and then read the Gorgias a couple more times to consider it. And first of all, I wonder about the relationship between the nomos and the phusis. The dissertation in the Gorgias never really clarifies if those two things are completely distinct or if there's some overlap. It seems like there would have to be, because philosophy seems to encompass the polis as well, in which case, wouldn't it be the case that every regime, as Aristotle and Plato point out, contains some kind of phusis, in which case then the demos also contains a phusis? I think that's the point Socrates is making when he brings up that Greek term for strength without wisdom. The demos is sort of like an avalanche or a tornado. They have a kind of power that's very hard to overcome. And even if you did overcome them, well, then they would become the new phusis that's laying dormant, ready to overthrow the tyrant and take power again. So that's one problem that has to be considered in terms of the raising of, phusis out of the nomos, which would then be the nomos of tyranny. And then another question concerns the, how to say this? Well, the problem of Callicles' wisdom and whether or not what he says is to be taken as being the true teaching of Plato. It may be, because Plato tried to get involved with politics later on. It didn't really go so well for him. But I know that in the essay that Strauss did, or the lectures that he did on the Gorgias, he makes a point of saying that, as a general rule, this could be the exception, Socrates is without equal. In every dialogue, there are no equals to him. And the only dialogues that have philosophers, he doesn't actually engage with them because he would have nothing to say to that person. So how do we resolve the possibility that Callicles is somehow superior to him, in spite of the fact that he's here literally to learn from Gorgias, who Socrates proceeds to refute? So there may be something there in terms of the esotericism of Plato's view, but at the same time, I think the question is that the demos, as we understand it, at least from Plato and Socrates, is the best regime, democracy meaning, for philosophy. That comes up in a number of the dialogues, is that, the tyrant is always going to be threatened by the philosopher, but it seems like of all the regimes, democracy is the one where philosophy can flourish. So is it possible that the tension between philosophy and tyranny is actually more apparent than it seems? Because how can philosophy even proliferate under a tyranny? It seems like Plato suggests that perhaps the tyrant needs a philosopher to advise him and be wise. I know that Xenophon kind of teases that out in his Hiero, but otherwise it seems like the best thing would be to practice Socrates' his own selective breeding, which is his midwifery, where if you knew the nuptial number or what have you, you could go around trying to create, superior men. But obviously that didn't work for Socrates. He didn't breed any superior men, or Plato didn't. But if you could do that, then perhaps you could improve the democracy. And the last point I'll make is that, perhaps there's something to the fact that, myself, I'm an American, I'm speaking from America, that here we are 2,000 years later, and the most powerful country in the world, or at least that has been, is a democracy in which, philosophy and freedom of speech has been allowed to flourish. So I think there's something there.
Okay, provocative stuff, Max. Let me see if either of the guys have anything on this one.
Just to address the first part, I think that you're right, Max, that there are some overlaps between phusis and nomos. These are, the ancient Greek terms, have many meanings in English. Alomariu uses them and almost, kind of hones them into terms of art for his specific projects. But you're right that the people have a nature each of the peoples of the world have a nature that, of course, can be wasted or preserved according to the regime that they live in. And on the other hand, the aristocrats, who supposedly governed by their attention to physis, also have a nomos, or a way of doing things, a kind of customs and laws. So you're right that they're not absolute. They're not an absolute opposition. They aren't binaristic poles on the. But I think I suppose what the way that they're used in at least the first half of the dissertation is just as sort of what are the dominant values, what's the reigning paradigm of the society. That's probably where I would leave that. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you really put your finger right on it. And I would encourage everyone to go back and carefully read Callicles' first discourse, which Alamariu quotes in part up to the point where Callicles begins to quote Pindar, fragment 169, and pay very close attention to the language used and exactly what he says, because Callicles speaks of the law of nature, the nomos of physis. He speaks of what is just by nature. And then he goes to quote Pindar, fragment 169, which begins, Nomos, king of all, mortals and immortals. So it's not, there is no nomos. It's not, I mean, the actual thing that Callicles is arguing for, I think, is subtle and is well worth kind of teasing out and reflecting on. He's saying there is a kind of nomos, a kind of justice that is in alignment with physis and that proceeds from physis, and that is not conventional arbitrary imposition. And unpacking that, I think, is just a very, very interesting direction to take.
All right. Let's hear from our new speaker, Dr. Dogdon.
Hello. Thank you for letting me in your. Thank you for letting me in your Twitter space. I'm just started reading the book. Not sure if Amalariu talks about this at some point. I'm still in the early chapters, but what kind of traits and I know that the whole selective breeding programs were usually done by regimes and not by individuals. But in current times, what kind of both genetic traits and teachings will you go on to pass on to your children and your generations going forward in order to reinstate these values that were lost by modernity?
Yeah, interesting question. You got anything on that, Spurgler?
Sorry, I'm busy. I'm being attacked. I'll be back in a second.
It's all good. Let me give you a general answer, Doxo Dom Dom. I have to look your name back up because I cannot read the characters in your username. I think the question here the beginning of the answer would be, well, who are you? And this is this is how we start this, right? It isn't merely what values should we pass on, but in some sense it has to do with the relationship between the names of these values or the orientations of these values, and what in your physical nature, what in your breeding supports them or goes against them. So that's a kind of cryptic answer, but I think it's the right answer. Okay, if we don't have any other speakers, I think we might be ready to wrap up. We've been going for about 2 hours. I'm at some point going to make a thread of our different spaces. Unfortunately, the first space on the book was lost to time when the great account known as Spurger Aqua is unjustly nuked.
There might be a way to get it back. We will see. There are tricks and whatnot. We will see.
Excellent. So at some point, hopefully, we'll make a thread with that space. And the other 3 we've done, which are still up on Charles's timeline, on the second, third, and now 4th chapter today. But as for this one, thanks everyone for listening. I do encourage you to look at the book. And thanks to our contributors, Stephen, Devin, Max, and Doxa Damdam. Everyone have a good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are.